What is up, everybody? This is the Fresh Baked Goods, and thank you for clicking on another Hell Let Loose video. So recently, Hell Let Loose had a PTE for patch 14.3, and with this playtest, we got our first look at the practice range. So before we do jump into this and talk about it, the first thing I need to mention is that this is not a tutorial. Team 17 made it very clear that this is simply a practice area where players can go to mess around and not necessarily a place for them to learn game modes or really how to play. Also, it's extremely obvious that this is the start of the process in building a complete practice range. So right now you only have the US faction available to try, and the commander role is not available. And it has been mentioned that other factions will get their own practice ranges down the line, as well as the commander getting its own practice area as well to use all those abilities and whatnot, but they are not available in the build that is in the PTE. But with that being said, it is important to talk about this because right now, this is the closest thing Hell Let Loose has to a tutorial. Even though it is not specifically a tutorial, there's no mention on if or when there ever will be one. So this is what we got, and it's the only game mode we have that will actually help players learn how to play Hell Let Loose, or at least certain aspects of it. But as I mentioned, this is the PTE, so things can change. This isn't a final release of it. So when you load into the practice range, you get 4 areas to go mess around in. You have an obstacle course, a building yard, a firing range, and a driving area. So let's first talk about the obstacle course. If you've ever played an FPS single player campaign in the last 20 years, it's basically the first minute of the gameplay from that, where you crouch, prone, and vault over a wall. You know, really just making sure you know the absolute basics to an FPS. It's simple and short, but at the same time, I have no idea what they could really do to improve on this. Maybe add different heights of walls to show what you can and can't vault over, or have different platforms you can jump to and from to learn the distance you can travel. But let's be real, Hell Let Loose has never been a game about movement, so just knowing the basics is enough to get the standard player by. And if you've already been playing Hell Let Loose for some time, this portion of the practice range really is not going to have anything to offer you. This is absolutely the most complete basic mechanic of movement in Hell Let Loose. So really, unless you're loading into the game for the first time, you're already going to know how to do pretty much all this. The building yard is exactly what it sounds like. It's just a walled yard with a bunch of supplies that you can build structures in. And here you can learn how to place blueprints as an engineer and then hammer away for minutes to build your structures. If you're new to the game or have never played the engineer class, this is actually a really easy way to get comfortable with how this process works without actually being in a real match. It's super easy to learn. But once you figure this out, or you already know how the NG role works, there's really not much point to being here. I guess you could try to come up with some layouts for defensive structures involving barbed wire barricades and bunkers, or make your own saw maze or something without having to be in an actual match to do it. But other than that, this is the complete basics. Someone that's familiar with the NG role, you're not going to be able to learn much here. This is really just a way to mess around. Now we have the shooting range, and the shooting range is going to be where most of the players spend their time here. They've added a bunch of scarecrows and targets for you to shoot at with 100 meters distance marked. And yes, if you do shoot the scarecrows in the head, it makes the ping sound. So this is actually pretty nice to jump into and click on some heads before going into a match. It sounds cheesy, but I've always liked to do stuff this and get like warmed up or something before actually playing. So I am all for something like this. But there are a couple issues though. I do feel like 100 meters isn't necessarily long enough to really learn how to shoot targets in Hell Let Loose. Most of the fights you're going to have in actual matches will be at longer ranges than that. Also, there's no moving targets. So really this shooting range is only going to help you get better at shooting targets that are stationary up to 100 meters. But hey, that's still something. It would be much more helpful if there were some sort of moving targets here. And maybe also if you combine that with a longer distance than 100 meters, you'd actually have something pretty close to what you're going to fight against in an actual match. But at the end of the day, they've made something that you can quickly jump into and fire away, which I will gladly take. And then we have the driving area, and this is really basic. They give you a Jeep, trucks, a Stewart, a medium Sherman, and a Jumbo 76, but this area is actually pretty empty. It's really just a field with some not so big hills in it. So really all you can do here is figure out the very basics of driving, you know, turning the engine on, going up and down through gears on the tanks. and really how not to stall. That said, they also did include some German tanks for you to practice shooting on, including a Luke's, Panzer IV, and a Panther. So if you don't know the basics of what tank can pen what for the US faction, this is an easy way to find out without having to go to an empty server, swap back and forth between teams. It really just makes it simple if you want to learn the basics of tanking. That said, you are stuck with having these German tanks in fixed positions that are actually at pretty close range. While they do respawn after a few minutes after you blow them up, you're super limited with this close range and you can't really get in these angles to shoot from. So again, similar to the firing range, this isn't really going to mimic what you're going to face in an actual match. It's really just giving you the bare minimum of information here. So outside of learning how to shoot Panther cheeks and a medium Sherman, there's not really too much to learn here, unless you're getting into the tank for the very first time and have no idea what you're doing. But really, this just makes it easier. It gives the player a space to try things out without having to figure out ways around the system in an empty server, which I am all for. Now, there are some massive things missing from the practice range overall. The recon vehicle and half-track are strangely missing from the driving area. Since the recon vehicle drives so different from other tanks, it would have been nice to have it here, but the half-track missing is by far a bigger issue in my opinion. Having that available for new players to mess around in would be awesome. They could figure out what happens when you turn it on and off and how it works as a spawn point without having them mess around with one in a live match. And speaking of spawn points, this is actually my biggest issue with the practice range in this PTE. You can't build garrisons in the practice range. The most important thing to learn in Hell Let Loose is something that you can't do in the practice range. Now, this is technically due to the fact that the area is in neutral territory, so your player simply is not allowed to place one down. This really, I hope they look at this. I hope they figure out a way and make it all like friendly territory or something, so that the player can just simply practice putting down garrisons. Just the fact that they can't even do that is kind of aggravating. In my opinion, there should be a whole section in the practice range dedicated to spawns. I understand this is not a tutorial, but I think somewhat of a focus on this would be helpful to bash the idea of player-built spawns being important into new players' heads, because at the end of the day, that's what Hell Let Loose is all about. So overall, the practice range isn't going to offer experienced players a whole lot to do or discover here. For new players that don't know or understand some of the Hell Let Loose basic mechanics, there's some decent information here though. To use a lot of the roles and equipment, you would normally need to join an empty server with a second player to gain access past the leadership roles. And that's only if you had that stuff unlocked in the first place. In the practice range, it's just available. So really, this isn't going to be anything that's going to hurt the game. It's only going to help it. And while a lot of players are probably going to be disappointed with the lack of stuff in here and really how it's focused to new players and not experienced players, I'm totally fine with that. You guys know me. Anything that will help players learn this game, even if it doesn't have what I want in it, I will gladly take. This is simply something that's better than nothing. And it's just going to offer players a place to learn some information. And while there's a lot of stuff that hopefully is added in the future, we got a good start here. I'm just hoping someday we get a proper tutorial. But again, it's a PTE. This can change by the time the patch actually comes out. Who knows? This is just what I saw in the PTE when I played it. But that's all I really got for you on the practice range. Thank you for watching. Thank you for everything you do. I'll see you dudes on the front line.